If you had unlimited money, how would you fix a broken economy? In 1897, one woman decided the best way to feed the poor was to throw the most expensive party in human history. This is the story of Cornelia Bradley-Martin. She was a billionaire socialite who wanted to be the queen of New York. She spent what would be $10 million today on a single night. She invited 800 of the richest people on earth, and she claimed she was doing it all for charity. But instead of saving the city, she started a class war. Instead of being crowned queen, she was chased out of the country. Most people think wealth protects you from consequences. This story proves that sometimes money doesn't buy you freedom. It buys you a target on your back. This is the party that destroyed a dynasty. Chapter 1. The Four Horsemen of Desire. To understand why this disaster happened, you have to understand the psychology of the Gilded Age. We often think that rich people buy things because they want them. But if you study human behavior, you know that isn't true. We buy things to unlock one of four desires: money, time, health, or status. In 1897, the Bradley-Martin family had plenty of money. They had all the time in the world, but they were starving for status. New York in the 1890s wasn't just a city. It was a battlefield, and the generals of this war were the society hostesses. At the top was the legendary Mrs. Astor. If Mrs. Astor didn't invite you to her ball, you didn't exist. You were a ghost. Cornelia Bradley-Martin was tired of being a ghost. She was tired of being just another rich wife. She wanted to be the sun that the rest of the planets revolved around. She didn't just want a party. She wanted a coronation. But there was a problem. A massive, dangerous problem that Cornelia chose to ignore. The year was 1897, and outside the windows of her mansion, the real world was burning. Chapter 2. The Reality Gap. Let me paint the picture for you. While Cornelia was looking at diamond catalogs, the rest of America was in the middle of the panic of 1893. This was the Great Depression before the Great Depression. Banks were collapsing. Factories were shutting down. Unemployment was at 20%. People weren't just poor. They were starving to death in the streets of Lower Manhattan. So, you have these two realities existing side by side. Reality A: children sleeping in alleyways, freezing to death. Reality B: the ultra-rich drinking champagne out of solid gold cups. Now, usually, when the gap between the rich and the poor gets this big, the rich try to be quiet. They hide. They buy unbranded clothes. They stay off the radar. It's a survival instinct. You don't wave a steak in front of a starving lion. But Cornelia Bradley-Martin? She didn't have that instinct. She decided that the best way to handle this depression was to be louder than ever. She came up with an idea that she thought was genius. She told the press, "I am going to throw a costume ball. But not just any ball. The greatest ball in the history of the city." And here's the twist. She didn't say, "I'm doing this for me." She said, "I'm doing this for them." Her logic went like this. If she threw a massive party, she would have to buy thousands of flowers. She would need hundreds of musicians. Her guests would need expensive costumes. And all that spending would trickle down to the poor florists and seamstresses of New York. She literally framed this $10 million ego trip as an act of economic stimulus. This is what we call rationalization. She wanted the status, but she needed a moral excuse to justify the expense. So she told herself she was a hero. She actually believed that by spending a fortune on vanity, she was saving the economy. Spoiler alert, the public didn't see it that way. Chapter 3. The Impossible Deadline. If you want to create a disaster, you need 3 ingredients: huge ego, bad timing, and an impossible deadline. Cornelia had all 3. She announced the ball in January 1897, but she set the date for February 10th. That gave her and her 800 guests only 3 weeks to prepare. Why the rush? Was she crazy? Actually, this was calculated. Remember her excuse about helping the local economy? She knew that if she gave her guests months to prepare, they would order their costumes from Paris. They would send their money to France. By giving them only 3 weeks, she forced them to buy local. They had to use New York tailors. They had to buy New York fabrics. She was forcing the money to stay in the city. It sounds smart on paper. In reality, it created chaos. Imagine 800 of the most demanding, entitled people on Earth suddenly descending on the city's tailors all at once. They didn't just want suits. They needed historical replicas. Kings, queens, knights, courtiers from the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries. They needed velvet, silk, ermine fur, real armor, and authentic jewels. The shops were emptied instantly. Household stores were ransacked for anything that looked like treasure. Seamstresses were working 20-hour shifts until their fingers bled, stitching pearls onto silk gowns for women who wouldn't even look them in the eye. The newspapers went wild. They started publishing lists of what people were planning to wear. And the numbers were staggering. Some of these costumes cost $10,000 back then. That is $250,000 for a dress you wear once. And that's not even counting the jewelry. One guest, seeking attention, leaked that he was coming as a savage chief, but covered in diamonds. Another planned to wear a suit of gold armor. This wasn't just a party prep. It was an arms race. Everyone was trying to outspend everyone else. And Cornelia was sitting in the middle of it, watching the chaos, thinking she had won. She had successfully captured the attention of the entire country. Everyone was talking about the Bradley-Martin ball. But she forgot one thing about attention. It's a double-edged sword. When you shine a spotlight on yourself, you better be perfect. Because if you have a flaw, that spotlight is going to reveal it to the whole world. Chapter 4. The Threat. As the day of the ball got closer, the mood in the city shifted. It went from curiosity to anger. Preachers started giving sermons about the ball. Reverend Dr. William Rainsford, a very influential priest at St. George's Church, stood up in his pulpit and condemned it. He didn't just say it was tacky. He said it was evil. He warned that this level of excess, while people were starving, was going to cause a revolution. And he wasn't wrong. The anarchists started watching. Remember, this is an era where anarchists were throwing bombs. They were assassinating leaders. And now, you have one building, the Waldorf Hotel, that is going to contain the entire ruling class of America in one room. It was the perfect target. Police Commissioner Theodore Roosevelt, yes, the future president, got involved. He realized this wasn't a party anymore. It was a national security risk. He had to surround the Waldorf Hotel with hundreds of police officers. They set up a cordon. They barred the windows. They had plainclothes detectives infiltrating the staff. Think about the contrast here. Inside, they are planning to hang tapestries and import 5,000 rare orchids. Outside, they are building barricades to hold back the starving mobs. Cornelia Bradley-Martin wasn't building a ballroom. She was building a fortress. But did she cancel? Did she scale back? Did she say, maybe this is in poor taste? No. She doubled down. She told the press that the criticism was just jealousy. She believed her own hype. She was the savior of the tailors, remember? She was completely blinded by her desire for that status hit. She was about to walk into a trap of her own making. And the most dangerous part? She thought the threat was outside the hotel. She thought the danger was the anarchists and the poor people. She didn't realize that the real danger was already on the guest list. Chapter 5. The Transformation. Let's talk about the venue. The Waldorf Astoria. In 1897, this was already the most luxurious hotel in the world. But for Cornelia, it wasn't enough. She didn't want a hotel. She wanted Versailles. She hired a small army of decorators. They didn't just bring in flowers. They brought in entire trees. They created bowers of roses so thick you couldn't see the walls. They covered the mirrors with garlands to create infinite reflections of wealth. They completely transformed the smaller ballroom into a supper room, designed to look like a French court. And the menu? This wasn't chicken and rice. They were serving canvasback duck, a rare delicacy. They had terrapin, which is turtle soup, a massive status symbol at the time. And champagne, not just bottles, rivers of it. They ordered the vintage 1884 Moët and Chandon. Thousands of bottles. The wine bill alone could have fed a neighborhood in the slums for a year. And remember, every single dollar spent on this was being reported in the papers. The numbers were being printed in black and white for every factory worker to see. Cornelia thought these numbers were impressive. She thought people would read $400,000 cost and think, wow, she is powerful. She didn't understand that to a hungry person, that number doesn't look like power. It looks like theft. So the stage is set. The date is February 10th, 1897. The windows are boarded up. The police are linking arms outside. The guests are arriving in their carriages, hiding their diamonds under cloaks until they get past the mob. Cornelia Bradley-Martin is standing at the top of the grand staircase. She is dressed as Mary, Queen of Scots. Her dress is velvet, embroidered with real gold. She is wearing a necklace that once belonged to the real Marie Antoinette. She looks out at the ballroom. She sees the Astors, the Vanderbilts, the Rockefellers. She sees the orchids. She hears the orchestra. In this moment, she thinks she has won. She thinks she has secured her legacy as the greatest hostess in American history. But she forgot how the story of Mary, Queen of Scots ends. Mary, Queen of Scots didn't die in a palace. She died on the chopping block. Cornelia didn't know it yet, but the guillotine was already falling. The party hadn't even started, and her life was already over. The music was about to begin, but the bill was about to come due. Chapter 6. The Night of Kings. The doors opened at 11 p.m. The guests didn't just walk in, they paraded. This was a performance. The floor of the Waldorf Astoria ceased to be a hotel and became a time machine. You had 50 different versions of Marie Antoinette. You had George Washington shaking hands with Louis XV. You had Japanese geishas waltzing with medieval knights. The air was heavy with the scent of 5,000 orchids and expensive perfume. The heat from the bodies and the gaslights made the room swelter, but no one cared. They were drunk on the spectacle. Cornelia Bradley-Martin stood at the receiving line, greeting every single guest. She was the queen, and they were her subjects. For a few hours, the illusion held. Inside those walls, poverty didn't exist. Hunger didn't exist. There was only gold, velvet, and laughter. But there was an eerie quality to it, too. Observers noted the jewelry. This wasn't costume jewelry. It was the real deal. Caroline Astor, the gatekeeper of society, came dripping in diamonds worth $200,000. That is roughly $7 million today. On her head, just walking around. Another guest, August Belmont, came in a suit of gold-inlaid armor that cost $10,000. The weight of the money in that room was almost suffocating. It was a concentration of wealth that the world had rarely seen in one place. And they danced. They danced the quadrille. They danced the waltz. They ate the rare duck and drank the vintage champagne until 4 o'clock in the morning. For Cornelia, it was perfection. Every newspaper had sent reporters, not to critique, she thought, but to marvel. She saw the flashbulbs popping. She saw the scribbling of notebooks. She thought she was generating buzz. She was generating evidence. Because while the guests were drinking inside, the mood outside had hardened. The police were struggling to hold back the crowds. The headlines for the morning papers were already being typeset, and they weren't writing about how beautiful the flowers were. They were writing about the obscenity of it all. Chapter 7. The morning after. The sun rose on February 11th. The hangovers set in. The costumes were discarded on bedroom floors across Fifth Avenue. Cornelia Bradley-Martin woke up expecting adulation. She picked up the newspapers. The reaction wasn't just bad. It was nuclear. The New York World didn't hold back. Their headline wasn't a celebration. It was an indictment. They juxtaposed the cost of the ball with the cost of bread. They calculated how many starving families could have been fed with the money spent on flowers alone. Other papers were even crueler. They mocked the guests. They called them out of touch, grotesque, and selfish. The economic stimulus argument? It backfired completely. Critics pointed out that buying rare orchids and French champagne didn't help the local baker or the local cobbler. It just moved money from one rich pocket to another. And then, the church got involved again. Sermons across the city that Sunday weren't about God's love. They were about the sin of greed. Cornelia Bradley-Martin was named specifically from the pulpit. She was turned into a symbol of everything wrong with America. But the worst blow didn't come from the press or the church. It came from the government. Remember, New York City was broke. The city needed money. And suddenly, here was a woman who had just publicly demonstrated that she had millions of dollars to burn. She had basically waved a giant flag in front of the tax assessors saying, "Look how rich I am." The tax authorities read the newspapers too, and they realized something interesting. The Bradley-Martins were paying taxes based on a certain assessment of their wealth. But this party suggested they were worth a lot more than they were declaring. If they could afford a $400,000 party, surely they could afford higher property taxes? The city officials didn't waste time. They opened an investigation into the Bradley-Martin family finances. They weren't just looking for a little extra tax. They were looking to double, triple, or quadruple their tax bill. Cornelia had tried to buy status. Instead, she bought herself an audit. Chapter 8. The Exile. The walls started closing in. The socialites who had happily drunk her champagne and eaten her food suddenly went quiet. No one wanted to be associated with this scandal of the year. Cornelia went from being the queen of society to a pariah in weeks. The status she craved? It evaporated. She was now famous, yes, but she was famous for being the woman who didn't know when to stop. The legal pressure mounted. The tax assessors were aggressive. They were threatening to sue. The public hatred was palpable. People would stare at them on the street. There were threats of violence. The Bradley-Martins realized they had made a fatal miscalculation. They thought America was a monarchy where the rich were worshipped. They found out it was a democracy where the rich could be eaten. They had two choices: stay and fight the taxes and the public scorn, or run. They chose to run. Cornelia Bradley-Martin and her husband packed their bags. They sold their New York home. They took their money and they fled to England. Think about the irony of this. She threw the party to conquer New York society. The result of the party was that she had to leave New York forever. They spent the rest of their lives in exile. They rented a manor in Scotland. They hung out with British aristocrats. They were still rich. They were still comfortable. But they were defeated. They had been kicked out of their own kingdom. The Bradley-Martin ball became a cautionary tale that mothers told their daughters. Don't be like Cornelia. Don't be too loud. Chapter 9. The End of the Gilded Age. This party didn't just end a social career. It marked the beginning of the end for the entire Gilded Age. It was a turning point. Before 1897, the wealthy could do whatever they wanted with impunity. But after this ball, the public woke up. The anger that started outside the Waldorf Astoria didn't go away. It grew. It fueled the progressive era. It led to labor unions, income tax, and regulations on monopolies. The excessive display of wealth by the Bradley-Martins proved to the average American that the system was broken. It proved that the rich had too much money and too little sense. In a way, Cornelia did change the country, just not the way she intended. She wanted to be remembered as a benevolent queen. Instead, she is remembered as the woman whose greed was so loud it woke up the working class. Chapter 10. The Psychology of Ruin. So, what is the lesson here for us? Why does this story matter more than 100 years later? Because human nature hasn't changed. We still see this today. We see influencers flashing cash on Instagram while their followers are struggling. We see billionaires taking joyrides to space while the planet heats up. The toys change. The costumes change. But the impulse is the same. It's the desperate need to signal status. Cornelia Bradley-Martin fell victim to this spotlight effect. She thought everyone was looking at her with admiration. She couldn't see that they were looking at her with disgust. She forgot the most important rule of power. You serve at the pleasure of the people, even if you are a king, or a queen, or a billionaire. If the people turn on you, your castle is made of sand. The Bradley-Martin ball was the most expensive party ever thrown. The bill was $9 million. But the real cost was much higher. It cost Cornelia her home. It cost her reputation. And it cost the American elite their invisibility. Sometimes, the most expensive things you buy aren't the ones with a price tag. They are the ones that cost you your soul. Conclusion. Cornelia Bradley-Martin died in 1920 in Scotland, far away from the ballroom where she tried to become a legend. The Waldorf Astoria where the party happened? It was torn down in 1929 to make way for the Empire State Building. The flowers wilted. The champagne was drunk. The costumes rotted away. Nothing remains of that night except the story. A story about a woman who tried to buy the world and ended up paying for it with her legacy. In the end, she proved the oldest rule of wealth. Money talks, but wealth whispers. And if you scream too loud, you might just deafen yourself to the sound of the guillotine being sharpened. This was the party that destroyed a dynasty. And the hangover lasted for a century.